In this section, we're going to have a look at how we can display information in a more visually effective format. Particularly here, we're thinking about when we want to display information using graphs and charts and images, as opposed to just displaying tables of data. And we'll look at 4 different principles, quite straightforward, but also quite effective, that we can use to help us better display our information visually. We'll start off looking at how do we make visual comparisons more easy, or the need to do that. We'll go on then to think about the importance of, where we do have graphics and text and data, of integrating them all together into one overall visual aspect that the user can look at and can see those different aspects. Similar to the first point, we'll then go on to think about if we have data that changes over time or over some variable, and we want to track that change, how, again, the importance of being able to easily do that visually. And we'll finish up with a fairly simple point about if we do have data where we can attach quantities to it, then it's important normally that we do so. So our first point then is make visual comparison easy. And this relates to any situation where you are showing information to the user, and one of the things you believe the user will want to do from that display of the information is to compare values, maybe a before and an after, or an option A to an option B, in terms of seeing the differences between them. And if that is from our point of view, the key thing the user is going to want to do, we want to make sure that we make that as easy as possible for the user to do. So to give you an example, over on the left hand side, in this particular example here, it's looking at number of beds and then sort of different settings under which those hospital beds could be used. We have 2 sets of data, one shown over here on the left hand side of the graph or the chart, one's showing over on the right hand side. It happens to be for inpatients and then residential patients. And in this setup, where we think the user will have an interest in comparing the values, you can see that if they're looking at this here, they need to look at the different colored bars. So there we have a solid blue bar, and then to move across and look at the corresponding solid blue bar in the other side. And with the 2 figures then, that enables those values to be compared. Now, fair enough, you can use this. You could look then at the purple bar. You could go across here and find the corresponding purple bar, and you can compare 66 to 44 and so on. But in doing this, if we think about, well, what are the steps the user has to do? In this sense, the user has to look over on the left-hand side, has to identify and remember a color, has to potentially identify and remember a value, has to go across to the other side, and then has to find that corresponding color or value, and then sort of think about what is the comparison between them. So it's not a difficult cognitive activity for most users to do that, but absolutely it does require a bit of mental effort to do it. There's several steps there. There's things that has to be held in memory. The example over on the right hand side is a much better way of doing it. It holds exactly the same types of data. Except here we've put the labels in the middle, and we have 2 bars, and you can see it ties into here the colors at the top. So you can see that hospital inpatients are this sort of color, where residentials are that sort of color, and the user can look at a particular item and then scan left and scan right to get a feel for the size of the respective bars. So it's much easier then for the user to be able to look at something, look a little bit to the side, look to the other side, and to do a compare and contrast. So from a cognitive sort of processing point of view, that's much more efficient to use. And we're all about here making things as easy as we possibly can for our users. Displaying multivariate data sets. So where we have a data set that contains multiple different data values. So it could be where we have maybe 5 different evaluations from option A, B, C, D, and E, or 5 different combinations of data, or 5 different groups of users, or any number at all. It's several items of data. Now, if that is the case, and we believe that the user will want to be able to compare elements between this, then it's important that we present the data in a way that enables the user to be able to look at those relationships. So this ties into user goals in terms of us understanding what types of comparison the user may want to do, and then to enable the user to do it. There's lots of different ways. You can see some of them displayed here, that if we do have multivariate data, that we can display and present it potentially in separate charts or stacked charts. So you use something that you think is an appropriate way for what you want to do. One of the important things about multivariate data is that if you feel that the user sometimes may be interested to see all of the values, or sometimes may only be interested to compare a couple of different values together, we should provide options to the user that we can enable or disable the display of some of those variables, so that the user can customize it based upon the particular aspects that they want to look at. We don't want to put them in a situation where if that is the case, where we always display everything, and then it's up to the user to be able to mentally identify and remember the bits they're interested in, whilst trying to avoid all of that visual clutter for the bits they're not interested in. For integrating text, graphics, and data in one display, so if we do have data we're going to be displaying, it is important to make sure that we have labels and legends and things like that that helps the user understand and interpret what they are seeing. Under the traditional way of displaying a graph or a chart, you might have a separate legend. That can be okay, but it also introduces a bit of cognitive fluid, because therein we're in a situation where the user has to divert their attention to the legend, then go back to the graph, and occasionally or potentially flip between the two different aspects. And that's, again, it's not difficult for most users, but it's cognitively involved. If we can, it's better to integrate all of these together on the same setup. So here we have some sort of pie chart like. We're associating our titles for each, or our labels of each of the different segments next to them. So if the user is looking, they can visually see what the relationship is. We're indicating a value again for that segment as well. So in this sense here, we're tying these things together. It's easy for the user to look at one particular bit and to see all of the relevant information for that bit within close sort of visual distance. And our final point, penultimate point, is it goes back then to the first principle. It's looking at changes over time, or being able to track the changes in a particular value. So if we are showing something that is relative to a defined axis, and most often it is over time, but doesn't have to be that particular way. We're just looking at something that is defined against that axis, and we think the user will reasonably want to see how the value changes across that axis. Now again, different ways to do it. We want to make it as easy as we possibly can for the user. So we've got two examples here. Over on the left hand side we have three different products, A, B and C. And down in the bottom we have, let's say, I don't know, it was total sales for the different products as we go across time. And you can see here we've got three different bars. So yes, the user can look at an individual bar and see relative to the different products how they did one to another. If the user wanted to track to see how over time it's changing, then they have to go to each item and sort of mentally or visually scan across to get a bit of a feel for how it's changing over time. And again, it's not a really difficult task for most users, but it's a little bit involved because you have that sort of visual skipping to be done. A better way to represent that you can see over on the right hand side. So here we're stacking these aspects together, we're visually showing them, and you get a much better feel for how something changes over time, and depending on it widening and shrinking, how it is growing over time and its relative size. So that's a much better visual way of being able to present the types of relationship, or to show the types of relationship that we feel the user is going to be interested in. And again, we're putting in our numerical label, so that helps provide the user with an indication of the actual absolute values. And that does then link into our final point in this section, that where we can quantify our information, we have numerical values that we can attach to it. We should show those. We generally shouldn't hide those. So we've got two examples here. Over on the left hand side we have two different categories. Over on the right hand side it's exactly the same, except we've added in then our numerical values. And in the previous examples you've seen, we've generally speaking added in numerical values. We've quantified what it is we're displaying. That's a good thing to do, because quite often those actual values, that's a level of precision that the user will want to see. And of course we want to quantify them in a way that's easily integrated into the image, so the user can find it and see it quite easily. So this brings us to the end of this particular section. In the next section we're going to go on to look at some common design patterns that we can use, and also to explore some platform guidelines as well.